My hypothesis is you build better companies and more profitable companies and more successful companies and more resilient companies by taking the morally right decision. How often have we seen really big and well-respected companies like Volkswagen and the diesel testing fiasco? Something drove someone or a system to make a bad decision. And in retrospect, that was clearly a bad decision. And at the time, that was clearly a bad decision. And that did not deliver any value. There was a short-term gain in that they were, able to acquire more of the market. That has absolutely cost them more in the long run. And that's what you've got to be focused on.
Do you want to go back to normal after Corona? Do you really want to go back to normal? I don't. Welcome to Not Back to Normal. I am Markus Strön, and I want COVID-19 to change the business world for the better. In each episode, I talk to entrepreneurs, business leaders, and change makers about how they have adapted in this crisis and how they further intend to change the way they live, work, and run their businesses for the better to make capitalism much more conscious and working for all. Today, I'm speaking with Chris McCulloch. Chris is the co-founder and CEO of RotaGeek, which makes scheduling easier for shift-based workers. Chris was formerly an A&E director, and thus he is in an enviable position to separate facts from fiction as well as government spin with regards to COVID. Because of his professional insights, we first talk about the virus itself, his view on how various countries responded to the pandemic, and his expectation of a second spike in transmission rates in the UK. In the second half, we learn how RotaGeek is making lives for hospital managers and clinical staff better, and why his company is offering their software as a service for free to the NHS at this stage. What I admire most in Chris are his strong moral principles, and I bet that at the end of this interview, or therapy session as he concludes, you will agree with me that Chris is not only one of the most humble and value-driven tech CEOs, but also a role model for a social capitalist in the 21st century, one who marries purpose and profit and embodies that with everything he says and does. And now I bring you Chris McCulloch. Chris, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for inviting me.
How do you describe what it is you do? What do you do for a living?
Broadly, I solve problems with incomplete information and I communicate with people, which is very similar to what I used to do in the medical world. In more detail than that, I'm the CEO and co-founder at RotaGeek. And in that role, my job is to look after our team, our clients, and our investors, and principally set the strategy for the company, with input from the team, make sure that we're operationally tracking to plan and to keep our investors engaged and updated. RotaGeek does as a company is delivers data optimized staff schedules to enterprise businesses. What that means in practice is that in the old days where businesses would schedule their staff, and many still do, on paper and Excel, we are able to take historic business data from clients, predict what their demand is likely to be, and then make sure that they have the right staff in the right place to meet that client demand. But the really nice thing is we make scheduling a much more cooperative process. And so staff can express a preference about when they work. And therefore, we can manage that work-life balance more effectively.
That sounds like a much needed innovation for all sides involved, really. And I'm quite curious, what's in the name? Why RotaGeek? Where does the geek come from?
So RotaGeek started way back in 2009, at which time I was working full-time in emergency medicine. So my background is that I trained as a doctor for 16 years and worked the last 8 years of those 16 in A&E, emergency medicine. And at the time that we set up RotaGeek, I set it up as a project. And I thought RotaGeek was a really good, summary of what we were trying to do. We were trying to be very mathematical and geeky about rotas and schedules. So I really liked it. And for the first 3 or 4 years, many people really hated it. I think we've sort of grown into it and we're quite comfortable in it now. There was a time where it felt slightly more jarring for a number of people, but that's the background to that name, 2009. Our very first logo had a animated geek type character. I showed it to my son who's 9 and he said, I've grown into that character as well and I look like him. So there we go. Maybe it's all meaningful in the end.
Fascinating. And so you mentioned that you've worked in the medical profession before as an A&E doctor. That is one of the reasons why I actually wanted to have you on the podcast, because you seem to be in a unique position to make actually sense of what COVID-19 is and what possible scenarios might emerge after the lockdown, and then also how you are actually going to tackle this with your company together with other companies, specifically tech companies and digital companies, because we need a lot of innovation. I always say we need to innovate out of this mess that we somehow created, or at least let ourselves slip in. So before we get into the whole tech and innovation side of things, what do you make of COVID-19? What are we looking at? What do we need to pay attention to in the sense of the risk of a resurgence or this so-called herd immunity? Or do we have an exit strategy in the UK? I'd just like to garner your views with your old hat on as a medical expert.
Maybe we'll work on like the current situation. If you want to work backwards over how it's evolved and how we've got here, we can do. If we consider the R value, and the R value being broadly the number of people that I will infect if I am infected. So if the R value is 1, in general, an infected person will infect one more person. What that means on a population basis is that the virus can sustain itself, so the numbers stay broadly the same. If the R value is below 1, then the number of cases decreases, because in general, if one person is infected, they infect less than one person. So the number of cases sort of burns down. And if the R value is above 1, then in general, one infected person infects more than one other person. Therefore, the number of cases and therefore deaths tends to increase. That concept's important in managing risk. And where we are now is, my understanding is that the R value is somewhere between 0.7 and 0.9, a sense and some data to support the fact that the R value is to the higher end of that, and 0.9 and maybe even higher. Maybe we'll just flag the caveat of the government's apparent comfort with not presenting clear data. And obviously the data is really important for us to make sensible decisions and assumptions about what the future might look like. So broadly, we're in a position that we would expect, with the R value being less than 1, that the number of COVID cases in the UK would decrease. And that does seem to tally with the reported number of cases and deaths in the UK. The additional interesting data is how many people in the population have been exposed. And because of the challenges with testing, and testing necessarily being focused on frontline staff and symptomatic individuals, then our understanding of how many people in the population have been exposed is limited. Now, there is some data, but before we get into it, the reason the level of exposure is important is there is in general, if you are exposed to a virus, your body develops antibodies, and it develops antibodies to attack that virus during that acute infection, but you maintain the memory of that in your immune system. So if you are re-exposed, it's likely that you will have some level of immunity, and that the level of that immunity varies. So it's unlikely that you will be 100% protected, the caveat that nothing is 100% in life. But let's assume, having been COVID exposed, you are less likely to get reinfected with the coronavirus. Exposure doesn't necessarily confer 100% immunity, and we don't know the sort of level of immunity which COVID exposure confers. But also, COVID is an RNA virus. So there's 2 types of viruses. One their genetic code is based on DNA, which is the same as humans. And some viruses like influenza and coronavirus are based on RNA, similar sort of molecular structure. They have one base different the 4 bases. But RNA viruses classically mutate much more frequently. So what we're likely to find in the virus is that it will change over time. And each time the virus replicates, it's got an increased chance of introducing an error in its genetic code. And therefore, just by chance, some of those will make it more or less transmissible. So that, more easily spread, or more or less dangerous. Now, the data suggests that viruses, as they mutate, tend to become less dangerous. So back to your question, the important bits of data are, in the UK currently, we've got this level of virus transmission, which is just below the level at which we would be concerned. So at 1, it's broadly neutral. Above 1, it's a bad thing. And we're somewhere between 0.7 and 0.9, probably 0.9. And then the level of exposure in the population, there is antibody testing being rolled out in the UK. And what that means is, unlike the very first test for RNA for the coronavirus, which tested for the RNA of the coronavirus. So it says, do you currently have the coronavirus? Now, if you had the coronavirus 2 months ago and you were tested with that test now, you'd be negative. The antibody test tests the presence of coronavirus antibodies in your system. So it says, were you exposed at some point? Now, that's really important for us to understand the level of innate immunity in the population. The Office of National Statistics released a report 2 or 3 weeks ago now, suggesting that the level of exposure is around 7% of the population. That then sort of takes us nicely into this area of herd immunity. So you'll remember from the very early days of coronavirus, one of the government's tactics was to say, well, listen, everyone is going to catch this at some point. Let's just get this out of the way. So an interesting interview with Boris on Phil and Holly in the morning, where he said, we should just take this on the chin. Now, might dig into that a bit more detail, but in order to herd immunity is a sort of population response to an illness, and it's how vaccination programs work. So you don't need to vaccinate 100% of people in order to reduce the incidence and or eliminate disease in the population. And the proportion of immunity that you need in a population varies, but let's say around 85% of people need to be immune. And what that creates is, in 1 million people, 85% of those, 850,000, are immune. And so if one person gets the virus, their ability to transmit it to someone else is limited, because 85% of the people on average that they meet, will be immune, and therefore they can't transmit it. And that's the logic of herd immunity. So if you decrease the effective transmission of the virus from an infected case. So stepping back to the current levels of immunity in the population, 7% is low, which is good in a way. So social isolation has clearly worked at limiting the spread of the virus. The problem we now have is we've got an R value of 0.9. If it increases, then we've got increased spread of the virus and increased cases. And we've got a largely naive population. So let's assume that 7% have some level of immunity. And let's, for the sake of this discussion, assume that it's 100%. 93% of the population are still at risk of getting the virus. Good job so far, but now what do we do? And the challenge is releasing lockdown is likely to increase cases and increase transmission. And we've got a population that is largely now vulnerable or remains vulnerable to the virus. That's the really interesting challenge that we face as a country, is how do you manage policy and sort of population response to government policy and direction that keeps the R value below 9 whilst increasing freedom and liberty and releasing lockdown as much as you can while sort of titrating against that R value. I guess that's the challenge that we face in the short term. Now, the things that will fundamentally change that will be a vaccine or an effective treatment. An effective treatment is essentially probably a stopgap, a holding position to an effective vaccine. Vaccine production normally takes in excess of 3 to 4 years. Now there's accelerated programs going on looking at developing vaccines within a year or 18 months, if that occurs. And I think it probably will. But if that occurs, it's genuinely a remarkable feat to have achieved that, from identification of a novel virus in 31st of December was the first officially reported case, to having a vaccine even within a year will be remarkable. And that will be the thing that will fundamentally change our options. If you then have a vaccine that confers immunity that is safe to use in the human population and a program that you can roll that out nationally, then what you essentially do, that's what vaccinations do, is create herd immunity. So you do that rapidly, and then the return to normal life can be much more accelerated. I might touch on what return to normal means. In the interim, you've got an option of effective treatments, and there's sort of 2 strands to this. You can use current drugs that might be effective against the virus, and then novel drugs and new research. New research for drugs is classically a very long process, 5 to 10 years, very expensive, so probably not an option, which is why a lot of the press coverage has focused on use of currently available medication that might assist with people who are sick with the virus. And that's either in prophylaxis, so taking it in order that you don't get sick, or when you are sick, taking it in order to get better. Probably a great example of that is chloroquine, which is an anti-malarial drug. Most malarial parasites are resistant to chloroquine. So I think if you travel doctor to get a malarial prophylaxis for travel pre-COVID, you would only get chloroquine if you were visiting Central America. I think maybe some places in South America. So it's sort of its value in malarial treatment is limited now. There was some early indications and some animal studies, a really small study, I think in France, that suggested it might speed recovery in coronavirus patients. President Trump has been a massive advocate of chloroquine, but turns out the most recent evidence is that people who take chloroquine have a higher risk of death and of complications. So chloroquine's a particularly nasty drug with side effects. So there's evidence that chloroquine isn't a good drug. But there you go. They're broadly your options, the things that will change our course as a company and speed up the recovery. Broadly is an effective vaccine or an effective treatment. There's one drug called Resdemivir that was developed for SARS, I think. That seems to be really promising. I think the challenge that might be cost and availability. That's broadly where we are. So we're in this sort of really interesting place in the UK where we're sort of feels like we're a bit on a knife edge. The R value is just within limits of where we would want it to be. We've got a very exposed population and we're now releasing lockdown. So it feels like a high risk position for us to be in.
What's your sense making, both as a human being, as an entrepreneur, as a medical professional? What do we have in store?
I think the way I view the world is shaped by having previously worked in A&E and also by founding a company. The skills that you have in emergency medicine are to make decisions on incomplete information. That is required when establishing a company because you have to take these risk balanced decisions without all the data that you would need. And it's really similar to how you work in emergency medicine. So if someone comes in with a big trauma and let's say he's unconscious and has been, in a road traffic accident or shot or stabbed, you don't know anything about them, but you can make some assumptions about what's happened to them in their current state. And you sort of acquire information immediately. They land in your emergency department, and then on the basis of you sort of generate a hypothesis that this person's injured, they're a middle-aged male, no other stigmata of other diseases. Let's assume that we don't know that they've got any past medical history. It looks like their predominant issue is trauma. Great, let's do an assessment. Let's instigate some treatment. And then as they sort of travel through your emergency department over the next 4 hours, you acquire more bits of information. And as you do, you'll modify your hypothesis and modify your treatment. And if you then sort of translate that to how you start a business and run a business, really similar process. You sort of have a educated hypothesis about where you think the world is going, what you think the value of your product is in a particular marketplace. And then you test it and you say, well, based on what we know at the moment, here's how we're going to proceed. And then you get new bits of information and you'll modify your hypothesis, and you need to accept that you will be wrong. But the idea is to sort of minimize how wrong you are. And I think, when looking at course over the next 6 to 12 months, it's a really similar process. It's bucket level assumptions. Our R value is quite high. There is a naive population, and therefore this is what this means. Maybe at this stage, just to call out the two ways that countries have dealt with it. So the UK didn't lock borders down early and didn't sort of jump on coronavirus at a very early stage. South Korea and Australia, I think, are good examples of a big response and a fairly rapid response to coronavirus. And South Korea is probably a good example of this, have reduced levels of coronavirus cases and deaths to very low levels. I think the number of deaths in Australia as of last week was less than 100, which puts in context the benefit, easy to say in hindsight, but the benefit of being very proactive in the setting of a pandemic. And what they're now able to do is release the lockdown much more quickly and much more aggressively, but still note that they will have a spike in cases. And we've seen this in South Korea, although it was associated with the South Korean government allowing children to go back to school. Actually, it was thought that it was due to the reopening of nightclubs. Whereas in the UK and many other countries, we didn't react so quickly. So we had a larger number of cases. And we're in this position where the government have to titrate their response, to judge their response against the R value. So how far can we push the release of lockdown while keeping the R value below 1. Let's say we're currently at 0.9. Whereas in South Korea, they can tolerate much more risk now because they were so aggressive early on at managing those cases, particularly things like border lockdowns and track and trace, etc. So with sort of that in mind, what I think is most likely is we understand our current position with the R value in the naive population. We're releasing lockdown. The government advice being stay alert, which, although is difficult messaging, broadly still means if you can work at home, stay at home, but there is more scope to, so moving away from the message of stay at home, you can go out and you can meet 6 people from 2 different families in the park, blah, blah, blah. And you are able to go to work if you can't work at home. So we're seeing more people out on the streets and a return, not normal, but a return to a more normal working practice for a number of people. That will increase the chance for increasing the R value. And I think we're so close to an R value of 1. I'm confident we'll see a second spike. I can't believe that we won't. Unless there is an effective vaccine, in the next few months and a huge national program to, it needs to be effective. It needs to have passed human trials, and there needs to be a national rollout program to deliver that big uptake. I can't see how we'll get away without a second spike. And therefore, and the way we're planning as a business is that we're seeing a release of lockdown now, but we will see a second spike, and therefore the government will be required to increase the restrictions, whether that goes back to a complete lockdown, as the government have been talking about, whether there are regional specific restrictions and lockdowns. Maybe, I think it'll probably be national, though. I can't see how we manage to release lockdown effectively without getting a second spike. Therefore, what that means in reality is we will be in some level of sort of restricted movement until the end of the year. And I think the earliest we'll see a return to some level of normal is in 2021.
So one of the things that I see emerging, or they've already presented themselves, are these demarcation lines with COVID-19 as far as your work setting is concerned. So I'm also one of the lucky people that can do the vast majority of my work online. You are a tech entrepreneur. You have people all over the world. You are sourcing them from a global talent pool that can do their work from home. And then it's almost like a striking irony, or just a really, really wonderful connection, that your business, RotaGeek, actually serves businesses and organizations that are largely dependent on shift-based workers like high street companies or the NHS. So I'm quite keen to dive a little bit into what you really think and feel about basically the people on the other side of that demarcation line, where obviously with what RotaGeek provides, you aim to make life better for them. Nevertheless, a lot of these people, for instance, in retail, they work on minimum wage. They have all these restrictions now imposed on them. What's your feeling about it, being on the other side of that demarcation line and having a business that clearly sees what it's like for people on the other side? Because I would suppose that you're quite customer oriented and that you're quite close to what happens on the other side. And so, what are your insights and how do you feel about them?
You are right. I see the situation that I've landed in and that we've landed in as a company as very lucky. There are thousands of people in the UK whose lives have been turned upside down and whose livelihoods have been taken away. And it's a conversation that I have with my team and my kids. The kids' response to this is really interesting, that they obviously don't know that this just doesn't happen every other year, and sort of explaining to them how unusual it is, but also how lucky they are that their impact on us has been to date relatively minor. It's really important to recognize that. And then I think the question you then face is, how can it be that it gets very rapidly into the sort of philosophical discussion, but how can we be okay as a country in the levels of disparity that we've seen? And this it goes back to coronavirus, like unmasking defects in our society that, because they weren't stressed or challenged, we knew they were there and they were, at a societal level tolerated, so the economic disparity in the UK and that not getting better. And as a society, there's a nod to it in political manifestos. We want to bring people out of poverty. It's the 21st century and we are one of the leading economies. We should have no people under the poverty line. That is ridiculous. And it's been a feature of political discussion for decades, and we haven't fixed it. If we look at what the country has done in the last 3 months, we know now that we can achieve amazing things. The reason for not achieving that is not practical. It's political or bureaucratic. We can bring people out of poverty. Another great example is the homeless. Within 24 hours of lockdown, hotel rooms were made available for the homeless to go and shelter. The fact that we have people homeless on our streets in the UK is a disgrace, and we can absolutely fix that. There is just not a political will to do it. That's a lesson that we have to learn coming out of this. And I hope we do, but I fear that we won't. If you look at the higher death rate among Black and Asian populations in the UK, the reasons for that could be multifactorial. I would absolutely bet that a vast majority of that is the sort of social and economic disparity that we see in the UK, and that's not okay. We absolutely have to fix that. And what coronavirus has done has just unmasked this population disparity in coronavirus cases and or deaths. It's easy to be shocked now by the coronavirus cases and deaths. We should have been shocked before coronavirus. The fact that we've tolerated that for so long, there is an opportunity now for us to fix that. And there is an opportunity for us to not have homeless people on our streets. And as a society, we can absolutely do that. If you rewind 6 months, what could we have done in advance to make our economy and society much more resilient? I guaranteed it would be less than what we've currently spent, and to adequately fund the NHS and to bring people out of poverty, and to just as a country say we will not have people in poverty, and to, provide enough homes that we don't have homeless people on the streets. We could have spent that money in advance doing that. And instead we find ourselves in a position that we are where, we find members of our and sort of subsections of our population who have been disproportionately affected by coronavirus because, they are in insecure jobs or on 0 hours contracts or, are in crowded housing or don't have a home and a roof over their head or are malnourished or can't afford to, heat their homes. And that is something that we could have addressed and we didn't. Those people are paying the price with a higher death rate from coronavirus, and we can absolutely fix that, and we absolutely should. As a country, we can do better and we should do better. If we rapidly go back to normal and we don't learn these lessons, we have failed. The lesson we should be learning is we have optimized our society for, efficiency and not for resilience. And that's what we need to look at, take a step back and say, great, how do we make our society more resilient and more fair and more equitable, and that we protect people? Because as Bill Gates said, this is pandemic 1. There will be more.
So there's this beautiful quote by Alice Walker. We are the people we have always waited for. And I'd like to know a little bit more about your free offer to the NHS and also your partnership with Locum's Nest. I mean, obviously, you're an entrepreneur, you're the CEO of RotaGeek, you want to make money with your product, yet I do sense some degree of doing goodness in this. And specifically coming back to the very interesting demarcation line that I consider you and your employees, I don't know any one of them, but you are basically the winners of all of this in the last 20, 30 years, digitization, globalization, free markets. I consider myself a winner in this whole thing as well. The startup culture, sky high valuations of companies. You just secured a financing round for 6 million from some really good investors. And yet on the other side, there are a lot of users that use RotaGeek software whose lives are precarious, driven by other people's motives, agendas, restrictions, and so forth. So I'd like to start with what it actually is that makes lives of those people better by using RotaGeek. And then I'd like to take you down a little journey of, and what else could you do in your role as the CEO of RotaGeek to invoke more of that change? Because when we say we actually mean I, because I am the only person that I can change and I'm in control of. What's your response to that, Chris?
You're right. Like as an individual, as a company, it's something that I think is really important and is sort of embedded in what we do to a certain extent, because what we do is create automated shift patterns, data optimized shift patterns for businesses and for companies. And our driver has always been to enhance the work-life balance of employees and of team members. And so in our mind, there's sort of two bits to that. There's the mathematical geeky side, which is really interesting. And then there's but how does that translate to make people's lives better? Maybe a health example. So doctors in the NHS tend to work template rotas. So they just work repeating patterns. And this was the case when I worked in the NHS. So, when I left 35, sort of mid to late 30s. And I would just be told, here's what you're working, here's what your pattern is, and it just repeats. While that's really good for the employer and for the NHS Trust, they know where I'm going to be and when I'm going to be there. And it's sort of good for me that I have visibility. It's hugely inflexible and not really the way that I want to work. What RotaGeek does is to match up multiple demands. And so what we're able to say is, what is the demand that an organization has? How many people are likely to come through the door in an emergency department or in a Pret or in a, other high street retail store? And then what people and what skills do you need to serve those clients? You can be much more thoughtful about how you deliver for people. So if you look at an emergency department, if you're going to see a spike in asthma cases, great, well, let's have the right skills on to deliver for those patients. But on the other side, you're able to be much more flexible and granular about staff work preference and flexibility and fitting into what was, pre-COVID, a really, really tough demands on lots of folks. So, how do you manage childcare or caring commitments or other challenges you might have on your time while you try to also fit in work and to survive? And that's what we do is, our platform allows staff to express a preference about when they work and to input their availability, which means they can get shifts that are more appropriate to their work-life balance and their sort of outside of work requirements and restrictions. I suppose at that level, part of the core of what we do is trying to improve people's lives. And we see that in the team. There's definitely this sort of dual aspect to being really intrigued by, how we mathematically optimize fit to demand. But then this understanding of, that's great, but if it doesn't actually change people's lives, then it's meaningless. And we do recognize that, we sell to organizations, and you touched on this, we run a business, we sell to organizations, but the vast majority of people that use RotaGeek are team members of our clients. And so we see us as serving them. And this then takes us to this sort of conflict, I suppose, of running a commercial organization. So, the background that I came from the NHS, one of the genuinely lovely things about working in the NHS is the sort of detachment of cost from need. So if you come into A&E and you need something, you will get it. And if you don't need it, you won't get it. And we can have a discussion about need, but that's the broad principle. So it's a really non-commercial way of delivering healthcare. I, for a while, struggled with this idea that, we're selling to clients and we need to generate a profit. This maybe leads us in nicely to the work that we did for the NHS. So very early on, it was clear that there were going to be, I guess I tend to think about the world in terms of scheduling. So it's clear quite early on there were going to be scheduling challenges. And maybe like mid-March, the challenges that the NHS were facing was, at what point do we stop running, routine services? At what point do we stop bringing people in for routine clinics and routine operations? There's clearly a political cost of that because waiting times will go up. And you could sense that no trust wanted to jump first, but it was going to be necessary to do that, and the timing of that was hard. But also they had to set up new services, and hospitals were looking at setting up new rotas and new schedules, and how they're going to staff this massive demand, and how are they going to cope with increased levels of sickness. So staff are certainly at a higher risk of acquiring coronavirus and therefore have to isolate for 7 days or 14 daes, up to 21 days within a shared household, depending on how it sort of rips through the shared household. That's hard, and how they're going to plan for that. And this is our bread and butter. This is what we think about all of the time. I guess my idea was quite early that we're in a good place to solve that problem. And that is, if you're a medical director or CEO of a trust, that is one of your problems, but it's not even your biggest problem. But we could help with that. And to try and commercialize that in any way was A, morally not the right thing to do, and B, would have limited the extent to which we could assist trusts. So one of the side effects of having investment is you have a board, and that's a good way to run a company because they hold you to account, which is good. And so I approached our board and said, here's my proposal. I want to offer Road2Keto Frontline NHS teams, and I want to do it for free. There's no trick. It doesn't auto-renew. We're not agreeing pricing up front. We are just saying it is free and you can use it. And they were genuinely supportive right from the outset. And we have angel investors. So we have a number of angel investors. And when I updated them, they were all supportive. So I think, again, that's a mark of having picked investors wisely. And I guess what that meant for our team is we were able to, in some way deliver something to the front line. And it's genuinely minuscule in the setting of the incredible things that were done in the health sector. But for us, it allowed us to take that scheduling pain away from organizations that we worked with and continue to work with. And it allowed our team to feel like they are involved in some way in easing the pain on the front line. And so for us, it was nothing but positive. It goes back to this principle that in tough times, the mark of the team that you are, or the people that you are, or the society that you are, is in how you respond to this. And I think, the way that our team responded to it and the way that our investors responded to it is a good marker that we've picked both of those groups well.
So the doctrine is that businesses have to serve their shareholders, increase shareholders' wealth, and of course serve the customers. And then in the last few years, there has been a great debate about purpose, about triple bottom line. There are some really good examples, actually, for instance, in Seattle, where the minimum wage has been surpassed tremendously. There has been this, I think it was called Fight for 15, a really, really big initiative, which was business-led, where restaurants actually pushed for a $15 wage per hour. And not really that surprisingly, the local economy has thrived, because when workers have more money, and especially the ones that work in restaurants, they spend their money in restaurants because they want to take their families out in a very similar environment and give them a treat where they usually work and serve their clients. So traditionally, an entrepreneur, a CEO of a company, doesn't really have to care too much about what happens in the world, because the economic system that you are embedded in with the investors and with those expectations create exactly these almost like cancerous developments that we have, that companies like Apple and Facebook and others as well, they are not really that productive as they make out they are, because they buy their stock back in billions, and that basically creates scarcity on the stock, which raises the earnings per share and which makes shareholders wealthier. But it's just not really fair, and they get away with it because the legislation allows them to. And obviously you are technically in the same boat, because you are a tech entrepreneur. But what I'm understanding very, very strongly, and obviously I know you, as you say, for a few years, your heart ticks quite differently. We're at an inflection point. At the end of the day, we have to do something, or we let the right-wing populists steal the show and create a world that possibly is even worse than what the world was like pre-lockdown.
Yeah, we can behave in a way that is consistent with values. And I think that is really important. And I guess my principle is, as we've alluded to, a lot of the decisions that I have to make and that we have to make as a company are based on incomplete information. And therefore, what's really helpful is having, I guess, really clear guiding principles. And you used to have these in A&E. My sort of overarching sense check of any decision was, when I go home tonight, will I be able to fall asleep and not worry about this patient? And if that's true, I've done the right thing. And doing the right thing is a really important driver for me, because it's a clear principle that stops you getting diverted and embroiled in these very time-consuming effects of not being principled and not trying to do the right thing. I think, when you're facing into a complex situation, if your guiding motive is, I want to get to the right answer, and then I want to sort of execute that plan as effectively as possible, even if you are wrong, you can genuinely stand up, hand on heart, and you can be scrutinized, and you can say, here's the base on which I made that decision. Here's why I thought it was rational. Here's why I thought it was the right thing. That's important for me. And, as time goes on, it hasn't let me down. The times where I diverted from that, and I can think of one example where a decision didn't sit well with my principles, and I took it, and it was definitely the wrong thing, and it was painful. And as individuals and as, I am, goes back to this, your earlier point, I am lucky to be in the position that I'm in. And I don't, I recognize that every day. And there is a responsibility that comes with that, which is to execute my job as best I can and to do the right thing. And they're not mutually exclusive. And this idea that being a company or a CEO means that you have to take, morally corrupt decisions is just not true. You can absolutely do the right thing and you can absolutely stand your ground. And I guess the more time goes on, the more forcefully I stand my ground because it is the right thing. And I have faced decisions where I would resign my position rather than make a morally corrupt decision. And it's important for me because, there is a life on the other side of this. And, it does become all consuming and it drives you to work 36-hour shifts. There is a line that I am not prepared to cross. When my time at Rhodesgeek ends, whether that's because, we've traveled all the way and manufactured a successful exit, or the post has outgrown me, and it's time for me to move on, I can move on and look back and think, great, I did a good job. Those principles have to be there. And I think it is incumbent on CEOs of tech companies to understand that the two are not only absolutely compatible. You can run a company and make the morally right decision, and you can also return value for your shareholders, and it's not a trade-off. Maybe the NHS example is a good one for Rhodesgeek. There is absolutely no commercial trick in it, and it's not a marketing ploy, and I would have done it even if nobody knew anything about it. The way for us to let the NHS know about it was to be relatively public about it. But we didn't know PR that was, trumpet blowing. We were just trying to let the NHS know that this was an offer out there. It was the right thing to do. But from a team point of view, it allowed us experience of working with more NHS clients, and it allowed us to deliver, and it allowed us to think about problems that we wouldn't have otherwise thought about. And there is a value in doing the right thing, and that value isn't commercial. But if we had taken a decision that I thought wasn't morally the right decision, so let's say we said, hey, listen, there's a massive opportunity, we can just commercialize this, and let's inflate our prices and blah 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 and close these contracts. The way of creating value in a company, and particularly a software as a service company where our business model is to generate content clients who continue to pay monthly subscriptions, is to work with clients and be an advocate for clients and a trusted advisor so they continue to work with you. And if you leverage your position, you will not sustain. The game there is you create short-term revenue, but you don't sustain and you don't create business value and don't create those lasting relationships with clients. It sounds a bit grandiose, me giving advice to big CEOs of tech companies, and there's a lot about their world that I don't know. But I'd like to see this understanding that the two are absolutely compatible. And actually, my hypothesis is you build better companies and more profitable companies and more successful companies and more resilient companies by taking the morally right decision. How often have we seen really big and well-respected companies like Volkswagen and the diesel testing fiasco? Something drove someone or a system to make a bad decision. And in retrospect, that was clearly a bad decision. And at the time, that was clearly a bad decision. And that did not deliver any value. There was a short-term gain in that they were, able to acquire more of the market. That has absolutely cost them more in the long run. And that's what you've got to be focused on. The point of being in this privileged position of being the CEO. And I think there is a whole load of bravado that goes with being the CEO. And all it means is you have the responsibility to engage your team and set the direction for the company and report to the board and engage your shareholders and make sure that you are making the best decisions for the company. In the vast majority of cases, those short-term opportunistic wins are sort of long-term costly for companies.
So I really admire you for your moral principles, and I'd like to apply them in some sort of like simulated case study, if you like, to the world of retail and high street life. So shops are closed. When they open, I'm going to be one of these consumers that will shop a lot less because I actually realized in this lockdown that I don't need that much and that all this stuff doesn't really make me happy and that I have to work more and that keeps me away from my loved ones. So I'm sure that rotas will change when the stores open. And if I just pick out one aspect, which is shops have a responsibility to implement social or physical distancing into those operations, into those teams. And my big worry is that whatever changes will have to be implemented will basically be at the detriment of the workers and at the profit of the companies because, they haven't made any revenue, any profits for months now. And there is obviously, from a systemic perspective, quite a lot of pressure to reboot operations first. So if you take, for instance, this whole thing about staggered start times, we've seen these news reports of the tube actually being absolutely packed when the lockdown was lifted partially. And my worry is specifically, for instance, that people just have to come 1-2 hours earlier, get changed, put their personal clothing in a bag, get into the shop attire, and then they basically just have to hang around. And then only when the shop opens and after everyone else sort of like uses the locker room, one after the other, only when the shop opens at 9 o'clock, the people actually get paid. Because we've seen this is the old normal. We've seen this in these precarious working conditions in other sectors as well, that some of the flight attendants don't even get paid to fly to the place where they then have to start working, even though you would argue that, a 4 or 5 hour commute somewhere to another country is absolutely part of your work. So, as I said, applying your admirable moral principles to a specific sector that also Rotor Geek happens to serve, how far would you go in terms of making some conditions, let's say, or weighing in with strong points of views, having your own podcast or blog, or, using LinkedIn, or just influencing your clients really to do the right thing? I guess that's what I'm really interested in.
Interesting. So the retailers with whom we have most experience are the retailers with whom we work. And one might hypothesize that they're a self-selected bunch of retailers, given that we work with them. So, it's not a random selection of retailers. But with that in mind, the hypothesis that you present, or the case that you present of, business is just going to screw the workers because, they haven't made a profit, blah, 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 that genuinely is not the message that we get or that we're hearing or experience of working with clients, because the entire economy is under pressure. Yes, there will be high street retailers and hospitality businesses that won't survive and that will need to restructure and that will need to change. That's the caveat of our experience working with clients, maybe just to sort of abstract it up to the entire UK retail or hospitality level. Again, I think this idea that big corporations will err on the side of screwing their staff because they absolutely have to survive, I just don't think is reflective of how the vast majority of businesses think about the world. And, yes, there are always examples of companies that recurrently fail to treat their workers well, or isolated examples within a company of where they could have done things better, or they didn't make the right decision. And I think it's important to differentiate that companies that treat their team in a systematic way that is harsh and unfair and restrictive won't survive. I just don't think they will. There is a clear commercial benefit in looking after people, and those people are your team, and they are the advocates for your business, and they are the people that when times are tough, as they are now, that you rely on. And if you don't build up that goodwill now, when times are tough, they absolutely won't be loyal to you. And that is the bed that you have made. And there is commercial value in doing the right thing, and I genuinely believe it. And I think that those examples that you mentioned at the beginning, they are companies that are at higher risk of not surviving because of the way they treat their people. It is a natural consequence of the decision they make. And from my, moral view of the world, it's right that they're at a higher risk of failure. Maybe just briefly you mentioned investment. It's really interesting how the world has changed. You mentioned early on the two types of investors. So in my head, the sort of Silicon Valley type investor, the game that investors play is they raise funds. So they raise investment from other institutions or other big corporations or very high net worth individuals, and they create a fund, so a pot of money, and they invest it in companies, and they've got to deliver a return. And the game is they want to deliver a certain multiple return on that fund. Let's say it's 10x, right? So 10 times what their fund is worth. And they do that by investing in 10 companies. And the Silicon Valley view, as you said, is I'll invest in 10 companies. I will drive those companies and I will kill 8 of them because I drive them so hard. But 2 will succeed and they will be amazing. I will have invested in the early stages of the next Twitter or the next Uber. And I will make huge amounts of money, and that will return my fund, and it'll more than account for the fact that I've killed 8 of my investments. As a founder and a CEO of a business, I don't want those people to invest in my business, because what they're saying is, I'm going to invest in you. And the game that I'm playing is there's an 80% chance that I'll kill you as I drive you to try and meet the rules of my game, which is to return my fund. We've always been upfront about that. And I think this goes back to your point, which is what can you do? And I think being principled and being upfront about why you hold these views and why you have this principle and not swaying from them. And we do that with investors, and we are upfront with investors, and we choose investors who are much more considered and say, well, listen, I don't know at this early stage, I can invest in 10 companies. I don't know who the successes are going to be. And so I want to look after all of my companies. And I expect, that I will achieve the same or a better level of return as these, sort of high growth investors that invest in 10 companies and kill 8 of them. And from a founder point of view, the second investor is much more compatible with how I think about the world. I want to do well, and I have to deliver a return to my early shareholders and my later shareholders. And so having a fund come in and sort of drive us in a different direction is not what I'm prepared to do. That means, though, that you have to take difficult decisions, and it means sometimes there's a low risk option that is not compatible with your principles. In my opinion, is never the right decision to take that low risk option at that stage, because it will bite you. The reason it's important to do the right thing is there is a cost of not doing the right thing. And there really is. And it just depends on the time frame on which you measure that cost. If you measure it in a short term, yes, the short term benefit of doing the wrong thing is huge, but the long term benefit is much less. So always measure over the longer term.
Yeah, I think investment and finance in general is a really, really good example. And I'm glad you've chosen the investor you've chosen. So my little step in the last few weeks has been to finally, after years of dismay and real frustration, I finally quit with my big high street bank. Extremely poorly in almost all categories, from customer service was absolutely abysmal. And then also how they actually invest their money. And I've gone to a bank called Triodos, which is, I think, a Netherlands-based bank. I think that this is really unique, is they list every single loan that they lend out to companies or organizations in the world. They actually list them in the annual report. So it's not like, we invest 50% of our funds in renewable energy. We invest in X, Y, Z. So you then, as a consumer who put your little money on, whether it's a current account or savings account, you actually know what it's being used for. Does it get me the same returns as the big high street bank? No. So absolutely to your point, there's a short-term cost, but it's minimal. But the key thing is that I no longer wanted to be complicit to a bank that's effectively using my money to fund arms trade or other things that I do not necessarily agree with. So if we zoom out from all of this, Chris, what do you think is the message really that we are meant to hear here? If Corona could speak, what messages does it have for us humans?
It's a good question. And I think individually, I hope that the message is that we care more and argue less and focus on the important and ignore the less relevant, and enjoy today, because the uncertainty of the future is always there. I mean, it really is. You never know what's around the corner. The level of uncertainty has increased clearly with coronavirus, but actually, it's just a feature of life. You never know what is around the corner later today or tomorrow. That's what I think the message is. We need to be more caring and considerate as a society and as individuals, and you see evidence of this. The Clap for Carers, I think, has been amazing, and you see people come out onto their streets and clapping and banging pans, and it is genuinely an expression of care and respect for the people that are putting themselves in harm's way, and perhaps we'll be more thoughtful about each other, and we'll be more caring, and we'll be less grumpy when we do commute on the tube or on trains or on the roads, and we won't be angry about tailbacks or the tube being full, and we'll be more understanding of the importance of the postman who continues to deliver your post in the setting of a massive pandemic, and just understand the impact that people have on your lives. I guess to your point about the decisions you make about where you buy and where you spend money, but also where you spend time, it's a really nice opportunity for us all to look at like what we do and what we spend and why we spend that. And are we too consumerist? Do we buy too much irrelevant stuff? I'm sure the answer is yes. And then as an individual, I guess by virtue of where I find myself for a job, in tech, maybe I just use that as an excuse. Yeah, I'm definitely an early adopter. I like buying all sorts of bits of tech rubbish to, experiment with. And to your point, have, a house with, Google and Amazon and Apple products. And you don't need those. And I don't need all of those. And I've definitely changed my view. I don't need the latest smartphone. It doesn't make any difference. And I'd rather not spend that. And I think maybe if we sort of draw parallels between how people and families might react in companies, the investors who invested in these very high growth companies, they're also very high risk. All of a sudden, the environment has changed around them. And now these growth investors are massively exposed. And part of the discussions that I've been having across the industry is how quickly can we get to break even? It's a really interesting discussion to have. And, it exposes those very high growth, very high risk companies. And we've seen some real successful companies that will be massively hit by coronavirus, and and their valuations will massively shift. And then if you draw parallels to families, I think it's similar. There is this drive in society, that you'll get a bigger house and a bigger garden and an extension and a blah blah blah, and and it's consumerist and it's not necessary, and it drives this cycle. You mentioned it earlier on. It drives this cycle of you earn more and then you spend more and then you have to earn more, and therefore that's a drain on your time. And I suspect, there are households who weren't expecting this, who've been absolutely devastated by coronavirus and that have been, financially ruined. That will change how people behave because they'll take a lower risk approach to all of this stuff. And then the question for families is, how do I build resilience and how do I, get to break even in inverted commas? How do I make sure that my expenditure is the same as my outgoings and I'm able to save so I've got some resilience? So I think there are parallels in that, and I definitely see that, and I definitely see me making better choices. I buy less rubbish, and I'm more thoughtful about the environmental impact and the social impact of what I buy and how I will re-engage with society. So I'm sure we'll see that. And back to that sort of population view of the world, I think the vast majority of the population will make changes. There'll be individuals in that population who make immense changes, and are individuals who just go back to normal. And that's just how how people are and how populations are. I absolutely believe that it's the companies who are driven by solid principles of doing the right thing will be the ones that will succeed in the long run, because they will the ones that will better meet the needs of their clients and their team.
I mean, listening to you, an image or an expression comes up, which is very typical in Germany, which is that of a social capitalist. Zooming out from everything we discussed today, I very much see you as one of them, as one of the social capitalists who say, yes, okay, I founded this company, I am a CEO, I do have to provide a return for my shareholders and serve my clients, make a profit, pay my employees salaries and so forth. And I got a strong sense that you have very strong moral principles, that you wouldn't get in bed with a business that would be absolutely atrocious. We can have a look in future. There were certainly retail companies in the last few months that have just absolutely shown some abysmal practices. Decathlon, it's a French retail company, was one of them. So I'd like to finish with a question which requires a fairly short answer. So you may want to think about this. If you had a billboard, if you could design a billboard with a single message on it in the context of our post-COVID-19 lockdown world. So we are coming back, we're going back to work, we're coming out of the woodworks. And, perhaps some people are gasping for normal, but at the same time, we don't want to go back to the old normal in its full glory because perhaps it wasn't that glorious for everyone. What would it say and why?
I think it would say, enjoy today and be excited about tomorrow. And the reason being, these are the things that I think we lost or were losing as a society and as individuals, just driven by that capitalist hamster wheel of, running and running and running. Again, slightly cliched, I guess, but this sort of enjoy today and live in the moment. And it's definitely something I've been guilty of, is not doing that and enjoying the moments that, I have with the kids in the morning, where they're, laughing about stupid stuff and, and we're playing and they, they don't have a care in the world. And for those 5 minutes, I can definitely be present and just enjoy that, because tomorrow it might all be over. And life is, and particularly in the setting of a pandemic, that young people die from this. I'm not that young, and we saw the Prime Minister in a position where he had a 50% chance of death. The effect of this is immense, and the imperative on making sure that you build a life that you love living is important, and be excited about tomorrow, because life is always uncertain. You never know what's around the corner. It's just more uncertain now. But with that uncertainty is a ton of opportunity, an opportunity to do good, or, an unexpected change in career, or, an unexpected experience, or, new hobby. And there are just amazing things. And because the world has been disrupted, these will become more apparent to people. Reminds me of two film quotes. One is from Ferris Bueller's Day Off. They're all 80s films. It's just reflective of my age. But in Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Ferris Bueller says, "The world moves pretty fast. You should stop and look around once in a while, or you could miss it." And I think the world is moving fast, and it's just important that we stop and sort of assess where we want to end up. And then the second is from Back to the Future, where I think it's Back to the Future 3, Doc Emmett Brown says to Marty McFly, "The future isn't written yet." And I think just understanding that, we are in charge of our own destiny, and particularly now in the setting of such a sort of global upset, the decisions that we've got an opportunity now to change the way that we live and behave and interact, and the principles that we have as individuals, we can drive a better society. These are the sort of the really good things that can come from this, global and human disaster. We've almost been like reset as a sort of global nation. All nations have been on lockdown. Everyone's been confined to their houses. Everyone's been reflecting on life and their own mortality and what they want out of life. That's never happened in the history of the world. And so these decisions that we would normally, come to and arrive at individually, we're all taking at roughly the same time. And I think the environmental and social impact of that can be huge. We just need to manage that in the right way.
Wow, amazing. Chris, where can people find you? How can they connect with you?
Two places, so LinkedIn and Twitter. I really love Twitter. I think it's funny. Don't really engage in it in a very sensible way. I'm not a Twitter expert, but I'm on Twitter, so at Chris McCulloch, and on LinkedIn.
Brilliant. Well, Chris, this was absolutely fascinating on so many levels. We covered loads of ground. Thank you so much for your time, for your insights, and for revealing your moral principles. Certainly not that easy to do this in public. I hope I didn't put you too much on the spot with some of these more philosophical questions circling around, I guess, the principles of a company or the purpose of the company or the moral stances of a CEO. I very much enjoyed that. Thank you very much again. And catch you soon.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I genuinely enjoyed it, and it's been like a bit of therapy for me. So I'm going to go and relax now. Thanks very much.
Thanks for listening, guys. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. You can find some useful links in the podcast notes. I have lined up some amazing guests for the next few episodes, and I would love your feedback, thoughts, and suggestions so that I can evolve this experiment based on what's needed in the business world right now. I want to make capitalism much more conscious, and for that, we need businesses to have more purpose, more people to show more leadership, and organizations to have more positive impact on stakeholders, including our blue planet, the only known habitable place in the universe. You can email me on hello@markusdroon.com or search for Markus Droon on LinkedIn. Please do subscribe to my podcast and share this with others. Catch you soon. Not back to normal.